Campfire Classics is a classic literature podcast. However, your hosts will occasionally use not-so-classy language and immature humor to describe very mature situations. As such, listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Ken Sandberg. Welcome to Campfire Classics, where we try to read those books that look really good on your shelf. Welcome back to week 4 of The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. We're going to finish the story this week. Much to our surprise here at Campfire Classics, this little mini-series has actually increased our number of listeners on YouTube. So that's cool. Apparently YouTube likes Algernon Blackwood. If you are one of our new YouTube fans, welcome to Campfire Classics. What you've been listening to the last couple of weeks is really kind of what we record when regular co-host Heather and I can't get our lives together enough to record a regular episode. As a result, we have been kind of short lately on innuendo and foul language. We hope to return to our more juvenile format soon, but until then, this is a literature podcast where I read you weird stories. I would recommend, before finishing this episode, go ahead and go back and listen to the last 3 episodes if you haven't already listened to those, because this is part 4 of 4, so you may be a little confused. However, if you want a recap of what we've been doing, or if you don't care and just want to jump in here, here's the story so far. 5 men entered the northern Canadian wilderness. They are Dr. Cathcart, his nephew Simpson, their guides Hank and Defago, and their native cook, Punk. They're there to hunt moose, but are having absolutely no luck. After a particularly rough night, Defago and Simpson head across the water to check out a remote, burnt-out part of the forest. In the wee small hours of the morning, they are awakened in their tent by something. Around sunrise, Defago runs out barefoot and unarmed into the trees, following a voice that seems to be calling his name. He also shouts out particularly concerning phrases about his feet being on fire. Simpson tracks his footprints, which run alongside those of a strange, unidentifiable animal. Defago's track slowly starts to match the animals as they begin to take larger and larger strides. Then they seem to take flight and then disappear altogether. Simpson eventually gives up his search, heads back to the boat, and rows back across the water to return to his uncle and the others. It's after dark when he finally pulls up on shore. Simpson manages to convince Hank and his uncle to go back and look for Defago by telling them a more sane-sounding version of what actually happened. They search but find absolutely no sign of their missing friend. Fresh snow has covered all the tracks. They settle back in at camp, but that night, a voice in the darkness, screaming about feet being on fire, and then approaching footsteps, tell them something is coming. And now, the conclusion. Let's start this fire. The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood, published in 1910 in The Lost Valley and Other Short Stories. Then at length, the darkness, having thus laboriously conceived, brought forth a figure. It drew forward into the zone of uncertain light where fire and shadows mingled, not 10 feet away, then halted, staring at them fixedly. The same instant, it started forward again with a spasmodic motion as if a thing moved by wires, and coming up closer to them, full into the glare of the fire, they perceived then that it was a man, and apparently that this man was Defago. Something like a skin of horror almost perceptibly drew down in that moment over every face, and 3 pairs of eyes shone through it as though they saw across the frontiers of normal visions into the unknown. Defago advanced, his tread faltering and uncertain. He made his way straight up to them as a group first, then turned sharply and peered close into the face of Simpson. The sound of a voice issued from his lips. "Here I am, Boss Simpson. I heard someone calling me." It was a faint, dried-up voice made wheezy and breathless as by immense exertion. "I'm having a regular hellfire kind of trip, I am." And he laughed, thrusting his head forward into the others' faces. But that laugh started the machinery of the group of waxwork figures with the wax-white skins. Hank immediately sprang forward with a stream of oaths so far-fetched that Simpson did not recognize them as English at all, but thought he had lapsed into some other lingo. He only realized that Hank's presence, thrust thus between them, was welcome, uncommonly welcome. Dr. Cathcart, though more calmly and leisurely, advanced behind him, heavily stumbling. Simpson seems hazy as to what was actually said and done in those next few seconds, for the eyes of that detestable and blasted visage peering at such close quarters into his own utterly bewildered his senses at first. He merely stood there. He said nothing. He had not the trained will of the older men that forced them into action in defiance of all emotional stress. He watched them moving as behind a glass that half destroyed their reality. It was dreamlike, perverted, yet through the torrent of Hank's meaningless phrases, he remembers hearing his uncle's tone of authority, hard and forced, saying several things about food and warmth, blankets, whiskey, and the rest, and further that whiffs of that penetrating, unaccustomed odor, vile yet sweetly bewildering, assailed his nostrils during all that followed. It was no less a person than himself, however, less experienced and adroit than the others though he was, who gave instinctive utterance to the sentence that brought a measure of relief into the ghastly situation by expressing the doubt and thought in each one's heart. "It is you, isn't it, Defago?" he asked under his breath, horror breaking his speech. And at once Cathcart broke out with the loud answer before the other had time to move his lips. "Of course it is! Of course it is! Only, can't you see? He's nearly dead with exhaustion, cold, and terror. Isn't that enough to change a man beyond all recognition?" It was said in order to convince himself as much as to convince the others. The overemphasis alone proved that. And continually while he spoke and acted, he held a handkerchief to his nose. That odor pervaded the whole camp. For the Defago, who sat huddled by the big fire, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot whiskey and holding food in wasted hands, was no more like the guide they had last seen alive than the picture of a man of 60 is like a daguerreotype of his early youth in the costume of another generation. Nothing really can describe that ghastly caricature, that parody masquerading there in the firelight as Defago. From the ruins of the dark and awful memories he still retains, Simpson declares that the face was more animal than human, the features drawn about into wrong proportions, the skin loose and hanging, as though he had been subjected to extraordinary pressures and tensions. It made him think vaguely of those bladder faces blown up by the hawkers on Ludgate Hill that change their expression as they swell, and as they collapse emit a faint and wailing imitation of a voice. Both face and voice suggested some such abominable resemblance. But Cathcart, long afterwards, seeking to describe the indescribable, asserts that thus might have looked a face and body that had been in air so rarefied that, the weight of atmosphere being removed, the entire structure threatened to fly asunder and become incoherent. It was Hank, though, all distraught and shaking with a tearing volume of emotion he could neither handle nor understand, who brought things to a head without much ado. He went off to a little distance from the fire, apparently so that the light should not dazzle him too much, and shading his eyes for a moment with both hands, shouted in a loud voice that held anger and affection dreadfully mingled, "You ain't Defago! You ain't Defago at all! I don't give a damn, but that ain't you, my old pal of 20 years!" He glared upon the huddled figure as though he would destroy him with his eyes. "And if it is, I'll swab the floor of hell with a wad of cotton wool on a toothpick, so help me the good God," he added with a violent fling of horror and disgust. It was impossible to silence him. He stood there shouting like one possessed, horrible to see, horrible to hear, because it was the truth. He repeated himself in 50 different ways, each more outlandish than the last. The woods rang with echoes. At one time it looked as if he meant to fling himself upon the intruder, for his hand continually jerked towards the long hunting knife in his belt. But in the end, he did nothing, and the whole tempest completed itself very shortly with tears. Hank's voice suddenly broke. He collapsed on the ground, and Cathcart somehow or other persuaded him at last to go into the tent and lie quiet. The remainder of the affair, indeed, was witnessed by him from behind the canvas, his white and terrified face peeping through the crack in the tent door flap. Then Dr. Cathcart, closely followed by his nephew, who so far had kept his courage better than all of them, went up with a determined air and stood opposite the figure of Defago, huddled over the fire. He looked him squarely in the face and spoke. At first, his voice was firm. "Defago, tell us what's happened, just a little, so that we can know how best to help you." He asked in a tone of authority, almost command, and at that point it was command. At once afterwards, however, it changed in quality, for the figure turned up to him a face so piteous, so terrible, and so little like humanity that the doctor shrank back from him as from something spiritually unclean. Simpson, watching close behind him, says he got the impression of a mask that was on the verge of dropping off, and that underneath they would discover something black and diabolical revealed in utter nakedness. "Out with it, man! Out with it!" Cathcart cried, terror running neck and neck with entreaty. "None of us can stand this much longer." It was the cry of instinct over reason. Then Defago, smiling whitely, answered in that thin and fading voice that already seemed passing over into a sound of quite another character. "I seen that great Wendigo thing," he whispered, sniffing the air about him exactly like an animal. "I've been with it, too." Whether the poor devil would have said more, or whether Dr. Cathcart would have continued the impossible cross-examination, cannot be known. For at that moment the voice of Hank was heard yelling at the top of his voice from behind the canvas that concealed all but his terrified eyes. Such a howling was never heard. "His feet! Oh God, his feet! Look at his great changed feet!" Defago was shuffling where he stood, had moved in such a way that for the first time his legs were in full light and his feet were visible. Yet Simpson had no time himself to see properly what Hank had seen, and Hank was never seen fit to tell. That same instant, with a leap like that of a frightened tiger, Cathcart was upon him, bundling the folds of blanket about his legs with such speed that the young student caught little more than a passing glimpse of something dark and oddly massed where moccasined feet ought to have been, and saw even that, but with uncertain vision. Then, before the doctor had time to do more, or Simpson time to even think of a question, much less ask it, Defago was standing upright in front of them, balancing with pain and difficulty, and upon his shapeless and twisted visage an expression so dark and malicious that it was, in true sense, monstrous. "Now you see it too," he wheezed. "You see my fiery burning feet. And now, that is, unless you can save me and prevent, it's about time for—" His piteous and beseeching voice was interrupted by a sound that was like the roar of wind coming across the lake. The trees overhead shook their tangled branches. The blazing fire bent its flames as before a blast. And something swept with a terrific rushing noise about the little camp and seemed to surround it entirely in a single moment of time. Defago shook the clinging blankets from his body, turned toward the woods behind, and with the same stumbling motion that had brought him, was gone. Gone before anyone could move a muscle to prevent him, gone with an amazing, blundering swiftness that left no time to act. The darkness positively swallowed him. And less than a dozen seconds later, above the roar of the swaying trees and the shout of the sudden wind, all three men, watching and listening with stricken hearts, heard a cry that seemed to drop down upon them from a great height of sky and distance. Oh, this fiery height! Oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire!" Then died away into untold space and silence. Dr. Cathcart, suddenly master of himself and therefore of the others, was just able to seize Hank violently by the arm as he tried to dash headlong into the bush. "But I want to know you!" shrieked the guide. "I want to see. That ain't him at all, but some devil that shunted into his place." Somehow or other, he admits he never quite knew how he accomplished it, he managed to keep him in the tent and pacify him. The doctor, apparently, had reached the stage where reaction had set in and allowed his own innate force to conquer. Certainly he managed Hank admirably. It was his nephew, however, hitherto so wonderfully controlled, who gave him most cause for anxiety. For the cumulative strain had now produced a condition of lachrymose hysteria, which made it necessary to isolate him upon a bed of boughs and blankets as far removed from Hank as was possible under the circumstances. And there he lay, as the watches of that haunted night passed over the lonely camp, crying startled sentences and fragments of sentences into the folds of his blanket. A quantity of gibberish about speed and height and fire mingled oddly with biblical memories of the classroom. "People with broken faces all on fire are coming at the most awful, awful pace towards the camp," he would moan one minute, and the next would sit up, stare into the woods, intently listening, and whisper, "How terrible in the wilderness are the feet of them that—" until his uncle come across to change the direction of his thoughts and comfort him. The hysteria, fortunately, proved but temporary. Sleep cured him, just as it cured Hank. Till the first sights of daylight came, soon after 5 o'clock, Dr. Cathcart kept his vigil. His face was the color of chalk, and there were strange flushes beneath the eyes. An appalling terror of the soul battled with his will all through those silent hours. These were some of the outer signs. At dawn, he lit the fire himself, made breakfast, and woke the others, and by 7 they were well on their way back to the home camp. 3 perplexed and afflicted men, but each in his own way having reduced his inner turmoil to a condition of more or less systematized order again. They talked little, and then only of the most wholesome and common things, for their minds were charged with painful thoughts that clamored for explanation, though no one dared refer to them. Hank, being nearest to primitive conditions, was the first to find himself, for he was also less complex. In Dr. Cathcart's civilization championed his forces against an attack singular enough. To this day, perhaps, he is not quite sure of certain things. Anyhow, he took longer to find himself. Simpson, the student of divinity, it was who arranged his conclusions probably with the best, though not most scientific, appearance of order. Out there, in the heart of unreclaimed wilderness, they had surely witnessed something crudely and essentially primitive. Something that had survived somehow the advance of humanity, had emerged terrifically, betraying a scale of life still monstrous and immature. He envisioned it rather as a glimpse into prehistoric ages, when superstitions, gigantic and uncouth, still oppressed the hearts of men. When the forces of nature were still untamed, the powers that may have haunted a primeval universe not yet withdrawn. To this day, he thinks of what he termed years later in a sermon, savage and formidable potencies lurking behind the souls of men, not evil perhaps in themselves, yet instinctively hostile to humanity as it exists. With his uncle, he never discussed the matter in detail, for the barrier between the two types of mind made it difficult. Only once, years later, something led them to the frontier of the subject, of a single detail of the subject, rather. "Can't you even tell me what they were like?" he asked, and the reply, though conceived in wisdom, was not encouraging. "It is far better you should not try to know or to find out." "Well, that odor," persisted the nephew. "What would you make of that?" Dr. Cathcart looked at him and raised his eyebrows. "Odors," he replied, "are not so easy as sounds and sights of telepathic communication. I make as much, or as little, probably, as you do yourself." He was not quite so glib as usual with his explanations. That was all. At the fall of day, cold, exhausted, famished, the party came to the end of the long portage and dragged themselves into a camp that at first glimpse seemed empty. Fire there was none, and no punk came forward to welcome them. The emotional capacity of all 3 was too overspent to recognize either surprise or annoyance. But the cry of spontaneous affection that burst from the lips of Hank as he rushed ahead of them towards the fireplace came probably as a warning that the end of the amazing affair was not quite yet. And both Cathcart and his nephew confessed afterwards that when they saw him kneel down in his excitement and embrace something that reclined, gently moving beside the extinguished ashes, they felt in their very bones that this something would prove to be Defago. The true Defago returned. And so indeed it was. It is soon told. Exhausted to the point of emaciation, the French-Canadian, what was left of him that is, fumbled among the ashes, trying to make a fire. His body crouched there, the weak fingers obeying feebly the instinctive habit of a lifetime with twigs and matches. But there was no longer any mind to direct the simple operation. The mind had fled beyond recall, and with it, too, had fled memory. Not only recent events, but all previous life was a blank. This time it was the real man, though incredibly and horribly shrunken. On his face was no expression of any kind whatever, fear, welcome, or recognition. He did not seem to know who it was that embraced him, or who it was that fed, warmed, and spoke to him the words of comfort and relief. Forlorn and broken beyond all reach of human aid, the little man did meekly as he was bidden. The something that had constituted him individual had vanished forever. In some ways, it was more terribly moving than anything they had yet seen, that idiot's smile as he drew wads of coarse moss from his swollen cheeks and told them that he was a damned moss-eater. The continued vomiting of even the simplest food, and worst of all, the piteous and childish voice of complaint in which he told them that his feet pained him, burn like fire, which was natural enough when Dr. Cathcart examined them and found that both were dreadfully frozen. Beneath the eyes, there were faint indications of recent bleeding. The details of how he survived the prolonged exposure, of where he had been, or of how he recovered the great distance from one camp to the other, including an immense detour of the lake on foot, since he had no canoe, all this remains unknown. His memory had vanished completely, and before the end of winter, whose beginning witnessed this strange occurrence, Defago, bereft of mind, memory, and soul, had gone with it. He lingered only a few weeks. And what Punk was able to contribute to the story throws no further light upon it. He was cleaning fish by the lake shore about 5 o'clock in the evening, an hour, that is, before the search party returned, when he saw this shadow of the guide picking its way weakly into camp. In advance of him, he declares, came the faint whiff of a certain singular odor. That same instant, old Punk started for home. An ancestral terror drove him. He knew what it all meant. Defago had seen the Wendigo. The end. And that, friends, was The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. I hope you enjoyed this journey that we've been on for the last month. I think that was great. I know it's sort of an old school horror, and for some folks it may have moved at we'll say a slower pace than you're used to in your storytelling and your spooky stories. But I thought that was great. Anyway, that has been all from this installment of Algernon Blackwood literature. Always a good read. Hope you enjoyed that. Reach out. Let us know your thoughts, whether you're listening on YouTube or whatever your podcast listening thing is. Let us know how you're feeling. Let us know your thoughts. Reach out. Say hi. We love to hear from you. You can message us at 5050artsproduction@gmail.com or any of our social media by just looking for Campfire Classics Podcast. Anyway, that's all for this week. So until next time, this has been Campfire Classics, where we try to read those books that look really good on your shelf.